Greetings, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to this latest edition of RE032, where I take old stories and update them to modern audio standards. This particular story is called The Storm Rider. But just a little side note here, if you are enjoying this sort of content, please hit the like button, and if I've earned it, please click the subscribe button as well. Anyways, on to the story. The Storm Rider, written by RegalLegalEagle. Lucas enjoyed first contacts like this. A stroll through a technologically inferior, yet still highly sophisticated culture often taught him much about the way intelligent species worked. It was especially nice when the new species were so friendly and open. The Marines had even left behind their gear in the ship. It was clear these Xenos would cause him no harm. To be honest, Lucas was happy to get away from the main group now and explore a little around the town. It gave him a chance to observe and think more freely. He knew there were other towns like this, stretched up and down the very thin stretch of land between the planet's massive oceans. But this one seemed to be the largest and most connected. They had technology on par with perhaps the height of the Roman Empire back on Earth, but none of the grand structures. They had a very simple buildings, yet very intricate and complicated sanitation and water irrigation systems. It was a curious contrast. No grand temples, no citadels or fortresses. They didn't even have an army, though there was some form of basic police or guard militia. The creatures themselves also interested him greatly. It was as if you took a human and an octopus and merged them together. Their faces were vaguely humanoid, though their eyes did creep him out slightly, as they resembled the eyes of cephalopods. They had hair which they kept orderly in a variety of colors on the blue side of the color spectrum, with pure white mixing in here and there. They were on the thinner side compared with a normal human, and their four-fingered hands were webbed, not to mention their very interesting skin that seemed to him to be able to change color and bend with their environment. But they made a clearly conscious effort to maintain one particular color or pattern and not change. Below their torsos, they had 4 or 6 tentacles instead of legs. One would think without bone structures that walking around upright would make no sense. Yet they kept their lower tentacles closer together and walked around on them like he did on his own 2 feet. Why? He found this as curious as everything else about them. They were amphibious and had no issues breathing underwater, so why settle purely above ground? Why walk like they had regular legs? He had so many questions. As he wandered the town, he found himself heading out towards the beach and the sound of the crashing waves. Much of the coastline of this thin, wandering continent was rocky and treacherous. He'd seen how much of it was a sheer cliff that dropped off 50 meters into the jagged rocks. But this town was built right next to a massive sloping sandy beach. There was still a great deal of rocks and boulders in the surf he could see, but clearly they'd made an effort to move them out of the way. Walking down closer to the edge of the water, Lucas looked out and then stopped, gasping softly as he realized the sheer scale of the waves stretching out ahead of him. From orbit, he hadn't paid much attention to the pictures. Waves were waves. But down here, he could see they had to be 13 or 14 meters high at least. As he watched one of the massive waves break and fall, the sound of it smashing down, folding into itself, just before the bay that held the town's beach, he began to understand why they built on land. If this planet's ocean was so rough and violent, wooden boats would be demolished in quick order. It was mesmerizing to him to stand and watch the giant waves crash down at the edge of the bay and to see all the water rush into the rocks and boulders pushed to the sides, filling the bay and racing up the beach just before receding to give way to another rush of water brought on by a thunderous implosion of another wave. He stood transfixed as he watched it, the crashing, booming echo of wave after wave washing over him just as the waves washed over the sand. Maybe this was why they had no churches or temples. Who would need such a thing when they could stand here and watch the power of nature itself? He finally tore his eyes from the scene before him to look around when he spotted one of the locals. Judging from its hair length, he thought it might be a female. But instead of ordered braids or tidy buns, he'd been seeing this one kept her hair wild. She stood at the high point of the wet sands, the water washing over her feet briefly with every wave. Tentacles. He had to correct himself mentally. Strangely, she supported next to her a massive plank of wood. It was polished and obviously crafted specifically with smooth, rounded edges and a rounded tip, but he didn't understand the purpose. He looked down at his dress shoes and pants, already sandy from the beach. He walked, shrugging it off, and walked further down to approach the native. The soft crunching of his shoes in the sand between the roar of the crashing waves, announcing his presence long before he reached her. He stood to her left, a meter away, and waited for some sort of reaction. But as he stood and waited, she just kept looking out over the waves. Finally, he decided that it was time to announce himself. I say to you greetings. May the rocks shelter you and the waves guide you. The ship's AI had worked out their basic language before they landed, and his translator had proved operational so far today. But the female just kept standing there, her wild, unkempt hair picking up a little as the warm breeze blew over the beach. Hello, he tried again and got nothing. After a moment, he shifted from foot to foot, unsure of how to get her attention and not wanting to reach out and tap her shoulder. What's with the board? Now the female finally looked over at him, and he smiled, despite how those eyes creeped him out. At least he had her attention now. It's for riding the waves. That was all she said before looking back out to the ocean. Lucas frowned a little. Most of your people are in town meeting my people. We just arrived from the stars themselves. Were you not curious? It wasn't usual for a primitive to be entirely uninterested in new people who came from another world, but this one didn't seem impressed. They forget their duty. We must watch and wait for his return. He looked from her out to the ocean and then back, wondering who else might be crazy enough to brave those waves. Whose return? He asked finally. The Storm Rider, she stated in. He paused. Was that English? His translator had done that. It sounded, The Storm Rider? He asked in English, and then arched his brows in surprise when she nodded. Yeah, you speak English? He tried, and then she looked at him once more. I speak Ancient, she said in English before returning to her native tongue. His language. I am the High Priestess Sheila of the waves and storms. I, as my mother and her mother and each generation have done, I am blessed of 4 generations to be alive for his return. Though the others speak of him as legend and myth, I know the truth. I see him in my dreams. I have read all the patterns of the waves. He will return soon for this height of the storm and wave. Lucas was stunned now. What was she talking about? He knew they worshipped some sort of ancient storm rider figure, but he hadn't given it much thought. If there were no temples dedicated to him, he didn't think the religion was well established. But she spoke some English and talked about the return of this figure now, after 4 generations of her people. Who is he? He asked in English, and she responded in kind. He is the one who delivered us from the storms. He who taught our ancestors not to swim between the rocks, not to be smashed against them at the will of the waves, but how to ride over them, to weave through them. He who taught us to be righteous in all things, that sharing is caring, but not to be total pinkos. He who has ridden the storm for 1,000 years, only to return to us and share in the bounty of knowledge and the love of the ocean. He who killed the great big fecking shark and shared with us the flesh and spared us its wrath. He who gave us the gift of surfing. Lucas realized by the end his mouth was hanging open. They weren't the first humans here, or at least human. There had been more than one, right? But how? Who? This planet wasn't listed. As far as he knew, they should be the first ones here. They hadn't found any comm relays or sensor buoys, and who would even be this far out? He had so many questions, but before he could ask, the native pointed out, He comes. When Lucas followed her pointing finger, he gasped out. There, riding a 20-meter wave, was a lone figure out in the distance. He could see him on some sort of board far more colorful than the wood plank the native used. He was riding it along the edge of the curling break of the wave. Lucas watched the wave start to crash down and gasped again, positive that as the water closed down on itself, the rider would surely have been crushed beneath it. But then, at the very edge of the bay, he shot out from the collapsing wave, seeming to skip over the water, weaving between the rocks and then riding up close to the beach, before jumping off that colorful board of his and picking it up, jogging up the beach towards him. Hey, Sheila! Not much of a turnout this year, huh? He reached out and the native extended her hand as well, before Lucas watched some sort of strange and sophisticated slapping and turning of their hands in a gesture that he didn't understand. Lucas looked the human over more closely now. He had a weathered face and body that looked to be in incredibly great shape, aside from being older. His hair was blonde aside from the graying temples, and he had one of the widest, brightest smiles Lucas had ever seen without it looking forced or fake. Yes, Storm Rider, they were focused on the new arrival of new ancients. When she mentioned to Lucas, the surfer turned and smiled wide. Hey, brochacho, mi amigo, am I glad to see you. Lucas barely had time to blink before the large surfer was engulfing him in a tight hug, further ruining his nice clothes and getting them wet. When the surfer finally let go, Lucas took a gasp for the air he stammered to find the words. Any words. It's about time you got your Broheim. I had to 2 more jumps of fuel. I was wondering when you would get here. Who are you? Lucas finally asked as his shock was overcome. Me, Broheim, you didn't read the file. I'm the gate supervisor, Jimmy Mantenzo. Well, I guess I'm the supervisor, but it's just me and Dave, the AI, and the robots and stuff. I didn't get the signal to turn on the gate. What gives? Gate? What gate? Lucas asked, still very confused. The wormhole gate. That's what you guys sent me here to make cheer. After a moment, the surfer tilted his head. Wait, are you not from tidal travel? Wormhole gates? Those have been outlawed for 1,000 years. You're a gate builder, Lucas gasped, finally starting to understand what was going on. Sure, 1,000 years, you say? Oh, man, I totally didn't mean to break the law. Am I in trouble? That bright smile finally faded a little. What? No, I don't think so. You were just a builder, right? I think that's fine. With that, the surfer laughed, a big smile coming right back as he slapped Lucas's shoulder hard enough to make him stagger. Cool beans, bro. Well, tidal travel is gone, so I guess I don't get paid. That's a bummer, man. But this place has some real cool waves and stuff. Maybe I'll just find a couch to crash on for a while. Hey, great talking to you, bro, but the waves are calling. I'll be back in a few hours when they die down. You ready, Sheila? He looked at the native, who nodded and picked up a board. Very ready, Storm Rider. I'm sure you are. Your great-great-grandmother or whatever could totally shred. Let's see if you can too. With that, they both began to run down the beach to get back in the water, and Lucas was left confused and stunned for a moment. But wait, why did you teach them to surf? Lucas called out. I came down here for the waves. The waves here are fucking sick. Then I saw some poor octo people trying to get up the beach, only to get smashed into the rocks. Had to help my little homies to get over the rocks, get him on land and teach him how to build huts and couches to crash on. They've got killer sashimi, dude. Once they figure out rice, the sushi here is going to be amazing. Talk later, bro. The surfer called out before pulling himself up onto the board and paddling out. Lucas blinked as he watched the two figures start to paddle out towards the massive waves still crashing down at the edge of the bay. Lucas was entirely at a loss for right now. He'd heard of some gate builders in the past going mad and trying to conquer primitive species by proclaiming to be a god or the like. He'd even heard of more cases of them trying to help out the locals in some small way. But this was certainly the first time he'd ever found a builder that had taught the locals to surf and, be righteous. However, considering the peaceful and happy nature of the natives and how welcoming they'd been upon the ambassador's arrival, Lucas was doing diplomacy wrong. Normally, it took a team of skilled sociologists, anthropologists, and other diplomatic experts to help prepare a species for the Federation. And here one man had done all of that on his own, because he wanted to surf, and apparently couch crash, and eat sashimi. Lucas slowly shook his head as he watched them get closer to the crashing waves. How the hell was he going to explain this to his superiors? End of story. I'd quickly like to thank the T5 peeps, Cold War Boomerwaffen, Severin Cerberus, Bushmaster 177, Henry the Red, Caspar Arnholtz, Cold War Boomerwaffen, Elijah Silvercross, Dragzoon WRE, and Severin Cerberus. Thank you very much.